Let's go through what I first think are the failures and what Democrats should do next time, okay? Okay. First failure is not getting Biden out sooner. Biden pitched himself as a transitionary force, that he was supposed to be the person who returned us to normalcy, got the country back on track before setting us on the right path. After 4 years, he could have argued, I've done my time. He could have looked at the approval rating and said, ugh, I've done my time. I've transitioned. Let's have a primary to see who will replace me. I am becoming older, and I would like to spend time with my family after serving this final period of service and making sure that we have, that we've preserved the decency of America by stopping Trump from being president, and then passing the reins over to an open primary. That would have been better. It would have been better. I didn't ever think it was a possibility because I thought the Biden camp was too stubborn. So I did not make as much of a fuss as I think maybe we should have. I don't know how much of a fuss we could have to change their minds until eventually Biden broke down on stage. I think that made it inevitable that they either had to change, because the internals that I'm hearing about from the Biden camp was like they were losing New Hampshire. They were losing everything. I mean, it would have been like they kept Delaware and Maryland. It would have been a bad election with Biden. I've heard some people say maybe we keep Biden would have been better. I've heard Lichtman say that. I think that's nonsense. I've heard Wick suggest that. I think it's nonsense. I think it would have been worse. I think the fact that it was as close as it was is not due to the fact that, we switched out and we second guessed ourselves. I think the fact that it is as close as it was is because we switched out. And if we didn't, it would have been much worse. And it wouldn't be 150,000 votes separating a Harris-Walz victory from a Trump-Vance victory in the swing states. It would have been something like 500,000. It would have been much worse. And I point towards enthusiasm increases from the base to go vote. And that was the biggest failure of the Harris campaign, was not getting voter turnout. It wasn't that Trump's flipped so many people. Even though he flipped Latinos, he did flip some people. It was the fact that Democrat voters from 2020 did not turn out again. So it was a turnout issue. It was a major turnout issue. Flipping Latinos sounds racist. It kind of does. It kind of does. So basically my point is Biden had to switch out before we had that public fiasco, which only further sunk confidence in the administration and in the incumbent. And I think that shook off onto Harris, which then leads on to the next failure, which I think is Harris did not do enough to distance herself from Biden. I understand that due to the nature of how she was chosen, which was Biden just chose her. And while I said that there should have been an open primary to choose the best nominee, to give the nominees more time to choose like the platform that works with the public and to kind of like test it out and clash against each other, and it gives the public more time to get to know them through choice, to give the public more time to buy in and to build enthusiasm early on. Like, I think that there's many reasons that a primary is good. I still stand by the idea that they didn't have a primary after Biden dropped out when he did. We didn't have the time. We didn't have the time for a scramble and for a fight to be so fresh going into the main race. And we had no time to have the voters vote. And so it would have been party elites choosing who the next nominee would be. And I don't think that the main problem here is that the Democratic Party elites, quote unquote, are not getting enough freedom of choice. And that's the reason that we lost. I think that you need to get public buy-in. And while Harris was not the best option for public buy-in, if we could start before the 2024 primary process had begun, but the primary process was basically already over, and they voted for Biden already. They've already voted for Biden with her on the ticket under the idea that she could be president. So she is the option with kind of the most public buy-in that is available to stop a quick Democratic Party civil war. So I think they still made the right decision given the circumstances and the amount of time they had. But if they could have avoided it altogether, still would have been much, much better. Doof. What next? Oh yes, the distancing from Biden. She needed to go out there, and I understand that since Biden picked her, it's hard to do it, but she had to be like, look, I am going to have more freedom as an independent person to be stronger on the border, and I will be stronger on the border, and I will make sure that we get more judges elected, and we'll make sure that X, Y, and Z happens, and I will fight against Republican weakness on the border bill and put it through whether they like it or not. And I will, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That Biden, has done his best to be cordial on this, but they are not my friends the same way that they're his friends from being up there for so long. And I will have a prosecutor's aggression or some way to differentiate herself. It doesn't need to be on immigration, but she had to differentiate herself from a way that seemed like a break to not only, I think, just show that, hey, majority of Americans don't think the country's going the right way. Just tying yourself only to the incumbent is not the smartest move. You need to show some break in that way, but also to show boldness, show some character, show some difference. One of the main difficulties of any VP running for president is trying to separate themselves from the current incumbent, is to define yourself as an independent person and not just as an extension of the last guy who held the office. And Harris had that problem for the entirety of the time. But also, due to the circumstance of how she got chosen, I think she felt a lot of social pressure from inside the Biden administration and possibly political career pressure not to cross wires with the Biden admin and undercut them on the campaign trail in the last months of the administration, when Biden had been generous enough to skip the whole primary process for her by choosing her as the party's nominee. And so I think she was divided between her personal loyalty after being given that political favor for being chosen to be the VP, and then to be chosen, essentially nominated by Biden himself to be the next nominee for president after Biden could no longer run, against her immediate political needs to separate from the Biden campaign, while also at the same time trying to claim the victories of the CHIPS Act. It just became a mess. And I think that was the main problem, that she needed to separate early. She needed to separate right away, too, given the circumstances. Like, for example, marijuana legalization, decriminalization. This is something that was getting announced during the end of the campaign as a way to try to bring back over black voters that polling-wise were not doing well for her as well as they should, so to speak, considering like previous voting demographics. And I mean, it wasn't delivered well, but it was delivered way too late. This is the type of messaging that you need to get out quick and early. And it would have been another way to differentiate yourself from Biden, and leaned into it that, Biden was the president. He passed the crime bill. I was not of that generation of politician. I want to be the part of the generation of reform. Would that have possibly smudged Biden a little bit? Yeah, but we're running Harris. We're running her. We're not running Biden again. We're running Harris. Biden is a lame duck. We need to run the person who isn't a lame duck and could be president. So more ways to break from, more breaking from Biden. This is a given, but more policy conversation, more concentration on policy, and more showing of how that policy breaks with Biden, new bold policies, and not just revamped versions of what they already have. We're going to build on this. We're going to build on that. It should also be throwing out new policies. Why not restart the conversation on a public option? Why not? That was a Biden proposal. So it's not even, wouldn't even be considered that radical, but we've completely avoided that conversation. It doesn't poll high on the list of American priorities. So maybe she was just scared not to do it for polling reasons. Okay, bold policies announced early on, as early as you can, so you can campaign on it. So we're not campaigning on marijuana legalization with a week to go. Earlier switch, if possible, Biden dropping out before all of this, having an actual primary process. Opening up the primary process is also something I think they should do. I think they should open up primaries to independents. Trying to buy independents into Democratic campaigns while they're still in the primary, buy them in early, I think could be very useful. And I think it's also more democratic. It makes it easier for people to also get involved in Democratic Party politics. I understand that there might be some concern for manipulation, but I think we can cross that bridge when we get to it, and we have yet to see that really work especially in a state with a competitive primary. So that's something I would advocate as well, is opening up the primaries. I think it wouldn't, and I know Andrew Yang proposed this in Politico, and I'm not a huge Andrew Yang Forward Party guy, but him saying that the party committing to have primaries, I don't think that's a bad idea. I don't think that's a bad idea. And the Democratic Party needs to give some image of reform. And I think one way to do it is by making sure that the process that makes your candidate stronger is done, making sure that's mandatory, so that the candidates have a period, that the population has a period to choose. I don't think that's a problem. They might be fearful of breaking with the idea of, if you're the incumbent, having to go through a primary. But even if they are, I don't think that would necessarily hurt the incumbent. I don't think it necessarily hurts the incumbent to be willing to step up to a challenge, and you can use the period to campaign. Of course, it opens up some potential political weakness, but I think the Democrats need to take risk. And the reason I think Democrats need to take risk is this shouldn't even be a close election. It shouldn't be 150,000 votes. It shouldn't be 100,000 votes. It should be 50,000 votes. It should be Harris winning this election by a landslide. They're running against a convicted felon who's got current cases open against him, who was found liable for rape on the campaign trail, somebody who is running grift after grift after grift after grift, was scandal riddled for every single second of his administration, is proposing wacky ideas with disastrous economic and geopolitical implications, and surrounding himself with people like RFK Jr., who is talking about taking fluoride out of the water. This should not be close. And so obviously there must be something wrong with the Democratic Party. There must be something wrong with the institution, because if there's not something wrong with the institution, then there's something wrong with the country, and that's going to be a lot harder to fix. Maybe it's a combination of both, but as Democrats, you have control over one. So, opening up the primaries, I think that's good. Committing to primaries, making sure we have strong candidates going into these elections, I think that's a good idea as well. I think that's a really good idea. I think they need to replace Jamie Harrison, who just resigned as DNC chair, with somebody who's won an election before. Somebody who's won an election. And when they replace them with somebody who's won an election, I want them to find somebody who knows how to win difficult elections. Somebody who knows how to run an aggressive campaign. Not somebody who's from a safe seat getting rewarded for party loyalty above all else, because that's a problem with the DNC chair position, is sometimes it's not chosen because somebody has shown themselves to be winners, like Jamie Harrison. He got elected into that, he got put in that position after losing an election. And they were like, what are we going to do with this guy? He's been so loyal to the party. Let's make him DNC chair. It shouldn't be thought about like that. It should be thought about who is best to fill the job, not who can we reward for being loyal to the party, to the Democrats. And I'm not saying Jamie Harrison didn't have any positive qualities. I'm just saying that it's kind of weird to give somebody a position like that after losing an election, okay? Hate to think like Trump, but we need to change the party. We need to change the speed we're going, because if we don't, then even if we beat like whoever replaces Trump in 2028, it shouldn't be close. It should not be close. We need a complete revamp in how we're using this money, because we got the backing of so much big money. I mean, we had like over $1 billion. Harris got such a gigantic increase in funds. Spending $100,000 on a Yes Daddy podcast for the worthless spending. And I don't think that that's the end all be all. But when we go around and we see how this money was spent, how much more of this money could have been spent trying to get voters out in Philadelphia? How much more of this money could have been spent trying to run policy-driven ad buys in swing states? How much of this could have been spent trying to just turn out the voters that we needed to turn out from previous elections, trying to get in contact with them on the ground? How much of that money could have been spent doing literally anything else? Anything else? Here's another thing. By the way, this is not a DNC reform thing, but just something that just hit me again because I was thinking about the Call Me Daddy podcast. We need a candidate that's not afraid to go into rooms that are hostile. And she did the Brett Baer interview, but that Joe Rogan interview with Donald Trump had like over 40 million views on YouTube alone. We're not even talking Spotify or other platforms. So we're talking like 40 to 50 to maybe more millions of people who watched it. I know he then put it on Twitter as well, and then millions more watched it. So we're talking 50 to 60 million people watching this interview. That's potentially that's like more people than watch the presidential debates. I know people watch clips of the presidential debates afterwards, but people did the same thing with that interview. And Joe Rogan didn't just interview Donald Trump, he also interviewed JD Vance. And for all the messaging that Democrats did about how weird he is, and he's still got some pretty weird beliefs. On abortion, he's got some weird beliefs, and he's got some very wacky beliefs when it comes to upholding our democracy as a checks and balance on the president of the United States. But on that podcast with no counterweight, not too bad. He didn't do too bad. And so these are spaces where we know that Democrats are underperforming with young men. We know the polling was showing that. And instead of trying to go to these spaces where the young men are, it doesn't have to be the Joe Rogan podcast. It could be other places as well. Instead, they did messaging like White Dudes for Harris, which I thought, like, they got a few cool endorsements, like the dude, that I think, oh, that's cool. You got the dude endorsing you. But I think it didn't really connect that hard. I didn't think it connected. I think it felt very artificial. And that's another problem, is that Harris, a lot of her story came off as authentic when you were reading it and when you were hearing about her story. But she didn't come off as authentic in a lot of these interactions with the public. And this is where I agree a little bit with Kyle Kulinski, that there's an authenticity problem in our candidates, and we need to be able to run somebody much more like a Tim Walz. I think Tim Walz was a good VP pick. Some people will say Josh Shapiro, maybe we could have won Pennsylvania. Even if we won Pennsylvania with Josh Shapiro, assuming that he would have picked up the votes, that still wouldn't have been enough to change the results of the election. We still lost one of the blue wall states, right? So I don't really think that could have changed much. But there's an authenticity problem amongst our candidate. And if people don't know our candidate that much after being VP for 4 years, and people are just learning about their story, we need them to be as authentic as possible in the shortest breach of time possible. And that means getting rid of the polished politician stick. And it's hard for me to give advice on how to be more authentic, but Trump just came off as more authentic, more unscripted. And that doesn't mean Trump didn't use teleprompters. He did. It's just very hard when you've been working to make sure you have prim and proper polished government statements your whole life to come off as not prim and proper and polished, while also being polished enough to not fall into the faults of Trump and start saying crazy and wacky stuff that you don't want to be saying on the campaign trail. It's a hard wire to balance on. I should think of more DNC reforms outside of just opening up the primary and swearing to primary elections, as in having the primary. I need to think of more DNC reforms. Of course, I'm talking about a leadership change as well. That's something I'm talking about. I know Andrew Yang said have Dean Phillips in there. I don't think Dean Phillips is the way to go. I think Dean Phillips was right about Joe Biden, which is good, but I don't think we picked Dean Phillips to run the DNC. Maybe he could be in some advisor position because we could be sure of his integrity to a point. But just because he was an early whistleblower does not mean that he's necessarily a good manager of the party. Just duh. The left needs to stop being so buddy-buddy with the centrists. The problem isn't being buddy-buddy with the centrists, but campaigning on the idea of how moderate and centrist you are, and that's just the point. If you go out there and you say a bunch of progressive policies and say, look, why don't we talk about feeding the kids in the schools? These are the type of moderate family values that we can stand by. I think that's okay. But when you're going out and you're toiling around with Liz Cheney more than an afternoon or two, but making a point to go town to town, city to city with Liz Cheney, someone who isn't particularly popular, doesn't have a high popularity rating, didn't even win re-election in her own state because she is a Republican who doesn't like Trump. It gets across the idea that Trump is hated by even people within his own party, that there is a place for those types of Republicans within the Democratic Party, but that assumes that we can make up enough of them to defeat Trump. That's the first thing. And it also assumes that these specific ambassadors are going to carry a lot of weight, which they ended up not carrying much weight, if any at all. And so that was like a bunch of wasted time and effort. Not like 1 or 2 stops with Liz wouldn't have been a problem just to get the point across. But honestly, there's probably other former Republicans, even if it was just a celebrity who calls themselves a former Republican, that probably would have been better to go state to state and city to city with to try to win over those voters. And at the end of the day, what hurt them the most was not turning out their own voters, not necessarily flipping any Republicans. Trump won 94% of the Republican vote. 94%. The never Trumper vote was just not that significant. Winning over either independents or bringing out your own voters ended up being much more of a valuable use of your time. Yeah, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a great example. Someone like that. Yes. Oh, man. So what other failures can I think of? What other failures? Okay, here's a problem I had. I think J.B. Pritzker is a fun Democrat teddy bear or whatever. But having him at the DNC bragging about being a billionaire before the CEO of American Express comes out to talk about how pro-business Harris is. If you're trying to win over a bleeding union vote that Trump is preying on hard, you need to be able to aesthetically separate your party from the party of the gold-plated billionaire and not have a guy up there being like, I'm a real billionaire. You're a fake billionaire. We're much bigger billionaires than you are. That's not going to work in getting those voters back to you. Who are you winning with that? You're jerking yourself off. You're not winning over anybody with that. You're winning over some billionaires, or you're winning over big money. The big money they overspent Trump on massively, and it ended up not meaning much at all, either because they spent it wrong, mismanaged it, or this election was part of a greater trend that money itself could not have influenced. Point is that if you want to win over those voters, you're going to have to pull back on you're going to have to really call to their union roots. You're going to have to go up there and be like, I'm going to do a 30-minute segment on the PRO Act and the importance of union organizing. I'm going to go out there and try to invest this money that would have been spent on these shitty ad buys on, white dudes for Harris, instead invested on talking about, good pay and good benefits in these districts and defending Medicaid and defending Medicare. I mean, look, I cannot tell you how to win back all the union voters, because I'm not saying that this would have been the thing that won them all back. All I'm saying is that if you want to make it like you're the populist who's talking about rent control, which is, I don't even think going to be that particularly of a successful policy, or, to fight the price gouging this way, why not hype up that populism in the way that Bernie did to get the base? And I'm not saying you got to be Bernie, but you don't got to be the billionaire either.
What do you think of Kyle Kulinski's idea of draft Jon Stewart 2028?
Jon Stewart 2028 would be something. I don't know, because on one hand, I think Jon Stewart would be extremely charismatic, and I do think that charisma is something that could play very well against because whoever comes next is not going to be Trump. So they're going to have a charisma deficit in a way that something that Trump provides now. And plus, Trump's going downhill. So I think he's going to have a charisma deficit soon anyway. But if we were to run somebody who, is entertaining and can keep the attention on themselves, yeah, of course, obviously that's an advantage. That's not enough. He still has to have policies and be able to differentiate themselves. Because, if it's just going to become like a Trump off and we just try to do it through performance, I think we're going to lose. There has to be some substance behind it. So Jon Stewart's going to have to differentiate himself as not just a comedian, but as somebody offering a substantive break with the status quo. But that's going to have to, we're going to have to see him define himself politically as not just, I'm the liberal or whatever. You get the idea. Trump lost the Senate, the House, and the presidency. I got faith he can do it again. Oh, I am very interested in what the midterms are going to bring. But how we do in the midterms depends on how this Democratic Party reorganizes itself in the next 2 years. Oh, here's another thing we should do. We should stop trying to get the more radical Republican options elected in primaries. We should, as a matter of practice, stop doing that. I'm not saying that it can never help us, but it's just playing with a hand grenade, and I don't like it. I don't like it. I don't think it's something that decided this race particularly, but I don't like it because it can backfire, and if it backfires, then it's your fault for getting the wackadoodle in public office. And you cannot on one hand be like, we need to reform the Republican Party to be normal, and then be like, let's pump up the fucking crazies. You can't do that at the same time. People got burned when they play with fire? What? That tends to happen sometimes. Every once in a while. Every once in a while. What's this about AOC and Nancy Pelosi?
I'm going to say what a lot of these folks aren't saying. I'm just going to say it. If you think that there is consensus among the people who want Joe Biden to leave, that they will support Kamala, Vice President Harris, you would be mistaken. And I'm going to say that because if they're going to come out and say all their little things on background off the record, but they're not going to be fully honest, I'm going to be honest for them. I'm in these rooms. I see what they say in conversations. A lot of them are not just interested in removing the president. They are interested in removing the whole ticket.
By the way, here's my big pointer for 2028. Let's not run Harris again. No running Harris again. No running anybody that has a long history of losing. Okay, we're not going to run Jamie Harrison. We're not going to run Martin O'Malley. We're not going to run Harris. We're not going to run Biden 2028. You know, that actually, you know what? Maybe no. We're not running Biden 2028. We need a new fresh break. We need a new fresh face. We need to give the public an opportunity to have public buy-in and a new candidate like we had in 2020. And the convincing message for who we end up picking cannot just be, let's be normal, let's not be Trump. It cannot be a return to normalcy. That was enough to get Biden across the line. But from the internal data we have, Biden's reelection was far from certain and probably very unlikely. And I think we need a new message entirely. I think that primary process for the voters should be open to buy in more independence while they're still on the campaign trail. And I hope it is competitive with many, many, many different people who will have at least the unified message of we need to end the era and the chaos of Trumpism. We've had a decade of this going into 2028. Do we really need now a new face for a new era to make this 2 decades, 3 decades of Trumpism? So new face, competitive primary, open primary. These are all things I want. Stop funding the crazy candidates on the fringes and pumping them up. That has a blowback effect that I'm still worried about. Don't think it was a big impact on this election, but it's something I'm thinking about. Stop with the spending on nonsense, which we're probably going to find out more about in the time to come. More authenticity. We need to inject it into our candidates. We need to be able to go into environments like the Joe Rogan podcast and places where we might not 100% be welcome, but we need to go to the voters where they are and speak to them there and invest in our own media information circles. Because if the Republicans are going to have their own information space, the Democrats will have to establish inroads into their own. And we saw some movement towards that this election with organizations like Progressive Victory, but not nearly on the scale of Republicans. And Trump was very forward thinking when it comes to, I don't know if it was Trump or the people around him, likely the people around him, on the type of podcasts and media he was doing this race. Trump was doing 1/3 of the amount of campaign speeches and stuff like that out there. as he was doing, like 1/3 of the rallies, 1/3 of the campaign stops, and yet he was still able to have a lot of viewership and garner a lot of attention by doing these alternative media programs that had very wide audiences that I think some traditional media heads still don't fully realize the implications of. The Joe Rogan podcast is depending on the day, depending on the month, depending on the news, one of, if not the largest podcast in the country. It has an impact. It has an impact. Whether or not you want Joe Rogan to have that kind of impact in our democracy is another question. That comes with your own investment. That comes with building. It comes with working with other groups to build them up. But in the meantime, you got to fight on the territory that's available. You got to find some good. You got to find the viewers where they are. Man, what else? What else? Oh yeah, stop with the performative "we're better billionaires than you" message to the working class. Okay, JB Pritzker is cool and all, but he should not be leaning into that at the DNC convention. The CEO of American Express, it's cool that he was, he supports Harris or whatever, but I don't know how important it is that he speaks at the DNC. Are you just trying to get inroads with the business community, or are you trying to use the event as a way to attract new voters? I think maybe it was a way to make Harris seem more moderate, but if you're trying to bring back those union voters, at some point you got to pick a PR lane. You can tell American Express privately that you're going to have a productive relationship with them, while openly not having to give them the platform to take up valuable time that could have been spent talking about criminal justice reform, talking about investing in unions and passing the PRO Act, talking about, defending American manufacturing, or whatever it is, to get those votes, making sure that those new chips jobs from these microchip plants are going to be union jobs, talking about green union jobs and the largest environmental infrastructure investment of any president in history. Like any topic could have been more useful than that. Any topic. Man. Oh, and if they could have kept Kathy Hochul away from the DNC, that would have been cool too. I mean, she's like toxic to any event, and you do not need to make your most public embarrassments the nation's embarrassments for these events just because they have power and they've shown loyalty to the party. You need to win, and with stakes so high, people's personal feelings and rewarding loyalty should be the last priority. Straight up BS. Democratic chair attacks Bernie Sanders' election critique. Sanders' analysis that Democrats lost because they failed working class voters scorned by party chair Jamie Harrison. Amid Democratic mourning over the loss of the presidential election to Donald Trump, the party chair risked deepening already growing division. By the way, he's resigned, so that seems like an acceptance of some responsibility. Of already growing divisions by rebuking the left-wing Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders for saying Democrats have, and I quote, abandoned working class people. This is straight up BS, Jamie Harrison, the DNC chair said Thursday. Joe Biden was the most pro-worker president of my lifetime and saved union pensions, created millions of good-paying jobs, and even marched in picking lines. There's more stuff he could do, but putting that aside, how is this sold to the public? How is this sold to the public? And how front and center was that pro-union, pro-worker messaging being presented to them? Was there any new bold way you're trying to present it to them, where you're delivering it to them and where the workers are, instead of just going through traditional union, hey, look, sorry to say this, but a union endorsing you does not necessarily mean the union's workers endorse you. And so you cannot just get the union's endorsement by doing what the union itself might want. You also are going to have to work towards getting the endorsements of the workers, because if the union's saying vote this way and you're starting to speak their language, that is a deadly combination that can inspire really good margins for Democrats with unions. But if you're just hoping that them sending an email to the workers saying we endorse so-and-so is going to be enough to get them all in line, you got another thing coming. Harrison is also defended Kamala Harris, the vice president who lost the election to Trump, for proposing policies that would have fundamentally transformed the quality of life and closed the racial wealth gap for working people across the country. He said, from the child tax credit to the $25,000 down payment for a house to Medicare, covering the cost of senior health care in their homes, there are a lot of post-election takes, and this one ain't good. Can we get the Sanders statement? Yeah, here we go. I want to just read the statement. It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change, and they're right. Here's the statement. That was just the first paragraph. I was just reading the tweet, and that was the first paragraph of his statement. Today, while the very rich are doing phenomenally well, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and we have more income and wealth inequality than ever before. Unbelievably, real inflation accounted for weekly wages for the average American worker are actually lower now than they were 50 years ago. Today, despite an explosion in technology and worker productivity, many young people will have a worse standard of living than their parents, and many of them worry that artificial intelligence and robotics will make a bad situation even worse. Today, despite spending far more per capita than other countries, we remain the only wealthy nation not to guarantee health care to all as a human right, and we pay, by far, the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We alone, among major countries, cannot even guarantee paid family and medical leave. Today, despite strong opposition from a majority of Americans, we continue to spend billions funding the extremist Netanyahu government, all-out war against the Palestinian people, which has led to the horrific humanitarian disaster of mass malnutrition and the starvation of thousands of children. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any idea as to how we could take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy that has so much economic and political power? Probably not. In the coming weeks and months, those of us concerned about the grassroots democracy and economic justice need to have some very serious political discussions. Stay tuned. Okay, so I think that, getting those Muslim American voters by moving to be stronger than Biden on stopping just the unending flow of weapons to Israel for this war might have helped with those voters. It might have also hurt us with Jewish American voters in states like Pennsylvania, where they make up 440,000 voters. She still performed overall pretty well with Jewish voters, but who knows if that would have changed if she would have made a public showing of going more aggressive to win those Muslim American voters in these states back. Maybe she could have walked a tightrope, and this would have maybe been what I advised, to pitch it as anti-Netanyahu, not anti-Israel. The Republicans would have tried to pounce on it and try to make it a disadvantage in a state like Pennsylvania. Maybe if she would have picked a VP like Josh Shapiro, it could have given her more coverage to do so. But then again, that could have just had the opposite effect of then angering the very people that you were trying to pick Josh Shapiro to be the tightrope walker in order for you to be able to go further than you would have otherwise. Point is, there's no surefire way out of this here when it comes to picking up the votes necessary to win. And so I think this is more a moral point that Bernie Sanders is trying to make. Whether or not it would have directly translated to a electoral victory, I think isn't really impacted by whether or not it's the right thing or the moral position. I think that's a separate question. As for the working class messaging, we are losing union voters. There is a problem here when we get endorsed by the union, but then the rank and file doesn't come out and vote for Harris. That's a problem. So it's a problem between union leadership and the union worker, but I think it's also a problem of our messaging, because we have a labor review board that is much better than the Trump one. I was with SEIU 1199 for the healthcare workers union in the DC area during the Trump presidency, and their labor board was dog shit. It was awful. It existed just to ignore the issue. They appointed people to head these labor disputes, or like, head representation of the U.S. government for labor, that didn't care about it, in the way that many people appoint those to head industries or head departments that they don't believe in, they don't think should exist. You just put people there who also don't believe it should exist, and so they treat it as if it doesn't. And that was the same thing during the Trump administration for labor, and the way that they stood up, or in that case, didn't often stand up for labor. He made blatant promises about keeping factories open that then he didn't help. Donald Trump said he was going to bring bring paid maternity leave after Hillary endorsed it on the campaign trail, that never delivered on it. He has been, with the Republican Party, undercutting the PRO Act, which would help empower unions' negotiating power and help revitalize the union movement in this country, which has been on a general downward trend for the better part of like 30, 40, 50 years. Republicans are going aggressive on legacy union admissions to these jobs. Okay, look, I could keep going on like, oh, here's all the examples of Republicans being anti-union, Democrats being pro-union. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day if this is not either communicated to the worker and by the union effectively enough, or effectively by the party through TV ads, etc. The party has to establish as much of a relationship with the individual union voter as they expect the union to have a relationship with. They cannot just expect the union to establish that voter for them. They have to go out and still earn that voter's vote. It should be like this. They go to that voter's house, they knock on that door, they have a conversation with that voter, convince them on their own merits, and then they're like, hey, by the way, I see you've got the UAW shirt on. Did you know UAW endorsed Harris? Oh, wow, I didn't know that. Or, oh, I did, but I hadn't talked to you before, but now it makes sense that we did. Yeah, I'll go with the union bus to the polling station. That's how it should work. That's how it should be approached. Assuming that the union bosses necessarily control the votes of them under them, or that all those voters are either convinced or have been told or properly debriefed on why Harris is better for unions or better for them, because not everybody just votes on the union ticket, because a lot of them could be genuinely convinced that if you deport all these people in mass deportations, that brings down the amount of available labor, brings up the value of their labor, and then brings up the value of their pay. Therefore, it's better to vote for Trump than Harris because it's going to bring up their pay. But then you go and you talk to them about the negative aspects of the labor movement under Trump, about the labor review boards, etc. And maybe you can after establishing that personal relationship, but you got to establish that personal relationship. You cannot just leave it up to the union. You can't.